Welcome to another episode of The Brand Called You, a podcast and podcast show that brings you leadership lessons, knowledge, experience, and wisdom from thousands of successful individuals from around the world. I'm your host, Ashutosh Garg, and today I'm privileged to welcome a very accomplished individual from the world of academia, Mr. David Lloyd Dusenbury from Budapest, Hungary. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much.
David is a senior fellow at the Danube Institute in Budapest, and he's an author, a philosopher as well. He's an author, and all of you know, I've always been very partial to authors. So he's an author of 3 books, Platonic Legislations, I Judge No One, and The Innocence of Pontius Pilate. And he's the chair for the Jewish-Christian Relations at the University of Antwerp for 22-23. So, David, before we talk about your book, I Judge No One, A Political Life of Jesus, tell me a little bit about your own journey and what got you interested in history and what took you to Budapest?
Well, to some extent, these are different questions, but let's see if I can bring them all together nicely. I suppose, all of my academic training is in philosophy, and I don't have to tell you that it's a bit unusual for a philosopher these days to be writing books about Jesus and Pontius Pilate. But really, it's in the course of my philosophical studies that I began to see that the Gospels are really influential texts in the history of European philosophy and law.
Yep.
And thus that, of course, Jesus is one of the great figures, not only in spiritual life, but in intellectual life. And it seems to me that a lot of people on different sides of kind of the conversation have forgotten this in recent years.
Correct.
So before Budapest, I was in Jerusalem at the Center for the Study of Christianity. And I suppose something I did in Jerusalem caught the eye of my current colleagues in Budapest and brought me back to Europe.
And as they say, the rest is history, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Wonderful. So let's talk about your book, I Judge No One, A Political Life of Jesus. I haven't had a chance to read the book, but I've read several reviews of the book as I was preparing for my conversation with you. So let me start by asking you, please give me a brief overview of the book and what inspired you to write it.
So I think I was inspired to write it simply by the sort of enduring intrigue I have with the figure of Jesus. So one of the things I find most compelling about him is how elusive he is. And when you read, of course, it's rather unusual that the churches have chosen 4 different texts to tell us about his life, right? And his sayings. And these texts are very similar, and yet they nevertheless differ in quite significant ways. And I don't have to tell you, there's massive literature built up over centuries kind of exploring these similarities and differences. But so like Socrates and like many of the other great thinkers of the past, I think the sense that there's always something more in Jesus that is leading you on is one of the reasons I wrote the book. But I suppose the basic kind of question I'm trying to get to grips with is why a figure who seems in many respects to be so uninterested in politics and even sort of resistant to political logic, nevertheless ends his life on a Roman cross as a criminal. So he's perceived as someone who is not only political, but some sort of political threat, even though his sayings and so much of his life seem to point in a different direction. So this was kind of the mystery that structures the book.
Fascinating. And, you talk about looking at the life of Jesus through a political lens. How do you think the teachings of Jesus can be interpreted through a political lens, given that most people view him as a religious figure?
Well, I'm afraid my answer to this question sounds extremely evasive. But it really is simply true to say that this question is so difficult that it's one of the enduring questions in Christian theology,
Mhm.
and I would say in European philosophy and politics, which is why I've written these two books you kindly mentioned. One about kind of the Roman trial of Jesus in European history, and now the life of Jesus,
Mhm.
among other things, to remind us, and by us I mean anyone who's interested in the history of very, very broadly speaking, the
Mhm.
European, the Christian world, um, just that so many philosophers and legal thinkers and political figures
Mhm.
down the centuries have tried to clarify this
Mhm.
question. What does it mean to revere someone who says, turn the other cheek, love your enemy, who praises a life of poverty,
Mhm.
when I think we can all agree that governments cannot simply turn the other cheek, at least
Correct.
not in every context.
Mhm.
And there's certainly a place for kind of law and punishment, which I try to show this place is recognized in the Gospels.
Mhm.
And so I guess one way to answer the question, but I want to underscore that this is very kind of crude
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
simplistic, but one way to answer the question would be to say that many of the sayings of Jesus, which do call us to really, quite difficult forms of toleration and love in
Mhm.
difficult circumstances. History is, human history is difficult.
Right.
It's pretty rough stuff. Um, that precisely because his sayings call individuals to these forms of behavior, and some of these forms of behavior cannot be realized on the level of governments, on the
Mhm.
level of politics. Therefore, we begin to see the differentiation between religious ideals and kind of political realities,
Mhm.
which again, this is an ongoing conversation. It never ends. And I don't think it should end, but
Mhm.
nevertheless, I think something interesting begins to occur where these two realms are not simply one and the same. What is good for the state is good for the individual, and vice
Mhm.
versa. It
Mhm.
seems that in the Gospels we begin to see, at least in the Mediterranean tradition, a really clear recognition that the deepest desires of the human soul are not necessarily the same as political necessities
Mhm.
or legal realities.
Mhm. And very interesting. And how did you approach your research for the book? And what are some very interesting, you know, discoveries, if I can use that term, that you made about Jesus along the way?
Well, I like the fact that you put discoveries in scare quotes because, really, truly, what I'm trying to do is remind people how interesting the texts are, as I've said, the biblical texts, but also
Mhm.
the tradition is,
Yeah.
and how many different traditions there are about the life of Jesus.
Mhm.
Um, I suppose one thing that might interest your listeners is simply the fact I've already referred to, but that from the very beginning, so in the first couple of centuries of the AD era, the
Mhm.
Common Era,
Mhm.
um, both pagans and Christians, and I would argue Jews, perceived Jesus as a kind of philosopher.
Mhm.
So there's a very famous text in the Jewish historian Josephus writing around the end of the first century.
Mhm.
And, I don't think we need to discuss this text in great depth, but it is an interesting text. But one of the things I point out is that Josephus calls Jesus first and foremost a wise man, a
Mhm.
sophos in Greek,
Mhm.
which is of course related to the idea of being a philosopher.
Correct.
And there are many, many other texts I could point to, but I'll just leave it there that both pagans, Christians, and Jews all saw him in some ways as a figure who reminded them of Socrates, who was
Mhm.
also a wise one, who did not claim to be doing politics, but he was put
Mhm.
to death as some sort of troublemaker in
Mhm.
Athens.
Mhm.
And then some very, very major modern philosophers whom your listeners might have heard of, like Immanuel Kant and Friedrich Nietzsche, even though they perceive Jesus very differently from some of the ancient texts I'm talking about, and from each other, nevertheless, in their philosophies, they're still trying to clarify what Jesus said, what he did, what it means for us. So I think maybe the main kind of discovery or contribution is just that anyone who's interested in the history of thought should really ask themselves who Jesus is and what his sayings mean.
Very interesting. And I want to come back to the part about him being looked at as or you looking at the political life of Jesus. Would you be able to, for my viewers and listeners, tell me one or two instances where you could draw such a conclusion about politics being somehow or the other associated with his work?
Associated or disassociated?
Well, you mentioned that the Romans saw him as someone who was interfering in politics, which is why I use the word associated.
Got you. Yes. So again, I hate to say the question is very complicated, which is why the book
I understand. Yes,
is sizable.
Well,
So
we're trying to cover a very, very huge subject in 25 minutes. So
exactly, which it's such a pleasure to do. But so it seems definitely that one of the crucial moments in the final week of his life is that he objects to a form of commerce which was being conducted in the temple in Jerusalem, and he disrupts this commerce, which was perceived by as I call them in the book, the temple elites. They were a kind of landed aristocracy in Judea. They're also called the Sadducees. This was perceived not primarily as a kind of prophetic act, which I think is how Jesus and his disciples perceived it, but rather as a kind of political incitement to rebellion and a challenge to their authority, which was both political and religious. And this is one of the interesting things I point out, maybe a kind of discovery. It's not anything new, but it's not something people talk about. And that is that when Jesus was living, and this is crucial for his death, Jerusalem was governed by a high priest.
Yeah.
So the highest office in Judea was that of a priest. And similarly, the Roman Emperor Tiberius was called the Pontifex Maximus, the highest of the pontiffs, the highest priest.
Correct.
So actually, rather than being something kind of strange about Judea, this is something that's very common in the world at that point in time. The political structure and the religious structure meet at the top with a priest. And it seems that something about Jesus' way of life and sayings sort of disrupts this model.
Very interesting. And the political message that you have drawn from his life, how has this either been co-opted or misinterpreted throughout history?
Well, I mean, one sort of only half ironic comment to make would be to ask whether it has ever been anything but co-opted and misinterpreted. And of course, to some extent, I think the criticism both of so-called Christian polities, but even of the church, is something that is always taken place within the church, as well as by those outside it, pointing out, corruption, abuse of power, hypocrisy. This is not something that only those outside have undertaken. I mean, I think this is one of, I try to argue in the book that the theme of hypocrisy, the whole question of hypocrisy, do you exhibit in your own life the ideals you claim in public? One of the reasons this is such a kind of prominent theme in, I would say, kind of modern European discourse and consciousness is actually due to Jesus. This is one of his themes. This is one of his great concerns, is that someone who is truly virtuous, truly good, truly loving is only so if they are in secret and within themselves, not just kind of in the sight of others. And so I think a very crucial turn, this is a long history and it's an unfinished history. I think a very crucial turn occurs in the 4th century. And I can put this very, very briefly in less than a minute, but we could talk much longer about it if you like. But at the beginning of the 4th century, so for 300 years, the Christians were quite peaceful. I mean, some of the leading historians have said there are no kind of acts of political violence associated with Christians for 300 years. They were often, not always, but often persecuted. And so it was a kind of movement of martyrs. And then, of course, the great Emperor Constantine the Great begins to sort of turn the ship of state from a pagan to a Christian polity. But before Constantine does this, Christians were advocates of religious freedom, religious liberty. And Constantine upheld this tradition, in fact. So at the beginning of the 4th century, even as he started to Christianize the empire, he was not really actively involved in persecuting anyone. At the end of the 4th empire, sorry, forgive me, at the end of the 4th century,
right,
the Christian Roman Empire began to sort of persecute so-called heretics. They began to be very stern, severe with their very considerable Jewish minority. And then a couple of centuries later, they began to harass philosophers, in fact. And of course, people have probably heard something about this kind of complicated and very long history. So the point I'm making here, though, at the beginning of the 4th century, the church and state both kind of uphold the idea of religious liberty. At the end of the 4th century, something different is going on, something I think lamentable. What occurs in the middle of the 4th century? This is the reign, brief but important reign, of a fellow known as Julian the Apostate. I don't know, does that name
no
mean anything to you? Well,
no.
okay, well, so after Constantine began the Christianization of the empire, one of his nephews became emperor, raised a Christian, very, very smart fellow, very clever, very philosophical. And he decided that Christianity was a sort of profound mistake for Rome. And so he tried to restore the pagan empire. And part of his restoration of the pagan empire, this was in the 350s and 360s, was to persecute Christians again. And so it seems, I'm coming to my conclusion, but it seems that basically after the reign of Julian, both the Christians in politics and the Christians in the church began to think we have to do things differently now if we're going to hold on to the empire. And this is kind of when the harder-edged Christian politics begins to emerge. And well, as I say, this is a very long and
fascinating.
ongoing.
No, that's fascinating. But just to continue with what you just said, is Julian the person who you would say was responsible for the concept of separation of church and state within the context of the life and teachings of Jesus, or was it just a process that started happening in from 350 to 400 AD or CE?
I think actually this is a wonderful question. I think to some extent the clearest formulation, I argue this in my book, The Innocence of Pontius Pilate, is actually due to a later pope rather than an emperor.
I see.
So at the end of the 5th century, there was an African pope named Gelasius, and at this time, the Western Roman Empire, which basically becomes the Holy Roman Empire, becomes what we now call Europe, had kind of fallen, And so the Roman Emperor was based in Constantinople, and you have the Eastern Roman Empire, which we call Byzantium, which was kind of facing Persia and India and much more open to the East.
Hmm.
And so the Pope was in Rome and the Emperor was in Constantinople.
Right.
And it's at this point that Gelasius writes a letter to the Emperor and kind of states very, very clearly that when Jesus appears on earth, something crucial happens, and that is that the head of the political system becomes distinct from the head of the religious order. And so one of the things that does happen at the end of the 4th century, between 350 and 400, as you just pointed out, is that Christian Roman emperors quit calling themselves Pontifex Maximus. They no longer call themselves high priest. So I do argue in my book on Pilate that this is really kind of a world historical moment. This is not to say that all of the problems dissolve, but that there seems to be a recognition both in the religious sphere and in the political sphere that something has changed.
Fascinating. So David, I have time for 2 more questions. My next question is that based on all the work that you have done, were there any misconceptions about Jesus or his teachings that you felt were important to address?
Yes. So to some extent, the inspiration for this book is a theory which kind of appears in the Enlightenment period, and with a very interesting German scholar who says, look, the death of Jesus is very simple. Jesus was a rebel, and he was treated as such. So to some extent, this is a kind of scholarly, mainly scholarly, but it is filtered into kind of popular discourse. This is a modern theory of Jesus, which I found unconvincing, and I really wanted to try to demonstrate doesn't line up with what we know of his life and thinking.
Wonderful. And my last question to you, and this is for the many, many, many people who will listen to our conversation. As an author, what do you hope readers will take away from I Judge No One, A Political Life of Jesus?
Well, this is the hardest question. So it is good that we saved it for last. I do suppose that in the end, I think that what Jesus brings to history, certainly to European history, is a really quite striking and enduring and challenging call to love. And that the human heart cannot ultimately be satisfied in life without striving to love. And of course, what his death demonstrates is that he did not say this out of any sort of naivete or romanticism, but rather kind of facing the savagery of much human history in the face, and nevertheless urging us to seek higher things.
Fascinating. And on that note, David, and I think this has been such a fascinating conversation about Jesus. I have a little understanding of Jesus. I've read a little bit about him, about you and your books, but I've learned so many new things in our conversation, a very short conversation with you today. Thank you for speaking to me about your book. Thank you for speaking to me about different aspects of how the different teachings and the different thoughts and political thoughts of people are being associated or disassociated with Jesus. Thank you also for talking to me about politics, interpretation, and different milestones in a very, very compressed kind of a podcast. Thank you again, and good luck to you. Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the brand called You.